Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This channel is focused on education and spreading information, especially on important theories of everything that you probably have never heard of before or aren't familiar with, except for on this channel. And we've been honing in for the last 9 months or so on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. Mr. Larson was an engineer in the 20th century, died in 1990. And for about 60 years before that, he worked out the details of the reciprocal system of theory. About halfway through that time, in the late 1950s, he put out his two fundamental postulates. And the basic idea behind the reciprocal system is that we live in a universe of motion. The universe is not made out of matter. It is not made out of energy. It is made out of motion. Matter and energy are just two different kinds of motion. And along with all the other scientific quantities that you can think of, such as pressure and temperature, I think to a certain extent, I'm still trying to understand what the coordinates of temperature are, but we will get into that very soon. Also, electric current and electric charge and magnetic flux and capacitance, electrical capacitance, electrical resistance, acceleration, force. All of these things are forms of motion. And they are, in Larson's definition of motion, motion is the relationship between space and time. It sets up a generalized reciprocal relationship between space and time, hence the name, the reciprocal system of theory. It's a reciprocal based on reciprocity, and it's a system of theory, meaning that if you understand how it works, you can plug the system into any subject and come up with answers. We will be looking at that, especially when we look at some of Larson's works on economics, or his primary work on economics, which is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. And we'll look at that pretty soon. But now, in his first postulate, there are two fundamental postulates. In his first postulate, he identifies a few caveats to that space and time thing. One is that both space and time are three-dimensional. He calls that coordinate time and coordinate space. Now, it doesn't mean in particular, I would just say that they have aspects that are three-dimensional. And they also have aspects that are scalar. What Larson calls clock time and clock space. We understand the clock. A scalar motion is a motion that has a magnitude, but it has no particular direction. And you can think of that like a clock. The clock is always getting later and later and later, but in no particular direction. Also, if you take a balloon and you put dots on it, you blow up the balloon, all of the dots are moving away from each other. You make some raisin bread, you put it in the oven, and when it starts to rise, all of the raisins are moving away from each other. These are scalar motions. This is what Larson calls clock space. Clock space, whereas in clock time, everything's always getting later and later and later. Clock space is that everything is always getting farther and farther and farther apart. And then the discrete unit postulate. Time and space come only in discrete units. There's a minimum unit of time and a minimum unit of space. If you don't have the minimum unit, then you don't have it. If you don't have a full unit of space, then you don't have space. And if you don't have space, then you only have time, and vice versa. And if you have exactly 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time, you have the speed of light. The speed of light is 1 over 1 equals 1. Larson calls it unit speed. And for Larson, unit speed is the background, or the null point, or the neutral point, or the starting point of this universe. So in order to accept the reciprocal system on its own terms, a universe of motion, you have to be able to conceive of motion without anything moving. Motion precedes anything that would be moving. So you have motion of nothing. And anything that actually might be moving is actually motion itself. The thing is motion. Matter itself is motion. And so, that takes care of, I guess, maybe some conceptual hurdle. Now, when you have the speed of light, or unit speed, as the null point, that means that you have half of the universe that is actually moving faster than the speed of light. Larson calls that the cosmic sector. And half of the universe that's moving slower than the speed of light. And Larson refers to that as the material sector. And the material sector is really the sector of the universe that the legacy scientists know all about, whereas they know almost nothing about the cosmic sector. Einstein himself said that the speed of light is the maximum speed of the universe, pointing to the fact that he only knew about the material sector and didn't know anything about the cosmic sector. But we can shore up our ignorance there, because if we know about the material sector, we can easily extrapolate over into the cosmic sector merely by, through the reciprocal postulate, by inverting the roles of space and time. So in the material sector, the sector moving slower than the speed of light, you have coordinate space, 3 dimensions of space, and you have clock time. The clock is always getting later and later and later. But in the cosmic sector, you have coordinate time, 3 or more dimensions of time, and clock space. The clock is, space is always getting farther and farther and farther apart. So Larson used that idea to understand a good deal about the cosmic sector. Now, there are some caveats to that that come out of, some of them come out of the discrete unit postulate. As I said, if you don't have a full unit of space, then you do not have space. And if you don't have a full unit of time, then you don't have time. Now, if you don't have a full unit of space and you don't have space, that means that you only have time. Because the universe is made out of motion, and motion is the relationship between space and time. So the whole universe is made out of space, either space or time or both. And that is a big difference from the other 3,000 years of science, or however long, is that everybody has always thought of the universe as not being, they thought of the universe as being bounded by space and time. Space and time is the container of the universe. But in Larson's system, space and time are the contents of the universe. You know, we normally think of activities going on in space, but we don't think of activities going on of space. Like that space and time are the contents, not the container. And so if you don't have a full unit of space, then you only have time. And that's what Larson calls the time region. The time region is the region of action in the area where you are dealing with less than 1 unit of space. And in Larson's system, 1 unit of space is approximately 4.56 times 10 to the minus 8 meters. So it's microscopic, but it is very large compared to the size of an atom. So it's very small, it's microscopic, 1/120 millionth of a meter, but it's still very large compared to the size of an atom. As far as time is concerned, if you don't have a full unit of time, then you don't have time. You only have space. And Larson refers to that as the space region. And the space region is the region of action where you're talking about activity that is occurring in less than 1 unit of time. And and 1 unit of time is the incredibly brief period of 1.52 times 10 to the minus 16 seconds. So in every second, you will find 6.576 quadrillion units of time per second. So it's inconceivably brief. And if you're dealing with units of time smaller than that, then you don't have time at all, and you only have space. That's the space region. So the space region is located in the cosmic sector, and the time region is located in the material sector. So you end up with kind of like the Taoist Tajitu, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the yin-yang symbol with the the wave in between, the circle with the wave in between, and then a dot on one side and a dot on the other side. Those dots are the time region and the space region, respectively. And then the dividing line between them is the unit speed boundary, or the speed of light. And so those are really the 3 boundaries that you're dealing with: the unit time, the unit space, and the unit speed boundaries, showing how the discrete unit postulate plays such a central role in Larson's system. So Larson, now that's the first postulate. The second postulate is basically minor in comparison, but it basically says that the universe conforms to the relationships of ordinary commutative mathematics. Its magnitudes are absolute, and its geometry is Euclidean. One of Larson's followers, Dr. Bruce Perret, who we're going to be hearing from again today, disagreed with Larson's Euclidean geometry basis, and he's claimed that the universe follows actually projective geometry, of which Euclidean geometry is a subset. And so he didn't completely disagree with Larson. He just expanded Larson's scope there to include other contexts. So Euclidean geometry is part of the reciprocal system, but it is not the full, it's just part of the reciprocal system. Anyway, Larson took those 2 postulates, and then he basically deduced an entire theoretical universe from those postulates. And I went over his process of deduction in some videos that I did about 8 or 9 months ago. That's called The Outline of the Deductive Development of the Reciprocal System. There's about 15 videos there, and it goes through the 165 steps of deduction that Larson went from the postulates to his theoretical universe, from which he wrote books on chemistry and astronomy and physics in general, in particular, and other subjects as well. So go back and look at those if you want to kind of learn Larson's thought process going from one stage to the next. Now, the scalar aspect of Larson's system is also very important in that, scalar motion is a motion that has a magnitude, but it has no direction, no specific direction. But what it also does is it shows different scales. So as, the balloon or whatever is expanding, the motion, it doesn't have any particular direction, but at each stage of expansion, the dots that are on the surface of the balloon maintain the same relationships with each other. And that's like a scalar motion. So in Larson's system, it doesn't matter whether you're on the microscopic atomic level, whether you're on the molecular level, whether you're on the level of a dust particle, whether you're on the level of a human, whether you're on the level of an earth, whether you're on the level of a sun, whether you're on the level of a galaxy, the rules are the same. So we have the same rules regardless of what level you're talking about, or you plug in the same rules. So that's shows the centrality of the scalar aspect of Larson's system. He plugs in the same rules regardless of whether you're dealing with an atom or whether you're dealing with a galaxy. Not exactly the same, but the same general rules. Like there are, you still have to deal with specificity. There are still specifics that are involved, but in general, the same picture is formed. Now, so Larson wrote all of his books and articles there between 1960 and 1990, or 1959 and 1990, and then passed away. He left somewhat of a following of a few dozen people at least, several of whom understood the reciprocal system fairly well. And many of these people were writing articles on various aspects of it. A few people wrote books. Dr. Ron Satz, this guy George Hamner wrote a book called The Quaternion Organon, which is worth reading. As Satz' book, The Unmysterious Universe. Nehru, KVK Nehru, Dr. KVK, Dr. Ron Satz, Dr. KVK Nehru wrote a book called what is it? I have a copy of it right here. It's called the collected writings of KVK Nehru. No wonder I couldn't remember it. And Dr. Bruce Perret. He didn't write any books as far as I know, but he wrote a ton of articles and had about 3 fora on the internet where he contributed a whole lot of writing. And he also wrote this thing called The Elixir, which is just kind of musings and different articles all put together. We are looking at one of the articles that was written by Dr. Perret today. And today, I believe, is the 8th episode where we've been going into this article. We've covered many of Perret's articles here in the last couple months. They're all written under the name Daniel Phoenix 3, which is one of Perret's nom de plume, and he reserved those articles, those Daniel paper articles, for some of his more speculative work, where he breaks away from, you know, the general physics, chemistry, astronomy, and goes into subjects far afield. And this particular article is called Geoengineering Chemtrails, HARP, Timelines, and Ascension. And we are about to start the epilogue here. So if you want to catch the beginning of this article, you want to go back about 7 episodes. Epilogue. Like almost every aspect in our society, it still comes down to a natural versus artificial condition, whether it be a natural person versus an artificial corporate person, real money versus fiat currency, or a natural evolutionary world versus an artificial 3D slave society. I know there is a lot of talk about divine intervention, ETs, angels, and whatnot coming to save us. Sit back, the cavalry is coming. Being of Cherokee descent, that never sounded very good to me, but all mankind really needs is an anti-globalist inoculation, so these monsters dry up and blow away. I won't call them human, because after what I've seen at Montauk, I don't believe they are. Now, Montauk is the point out at the end of Long Island where they did the Montauk Project, and that's the Phoenix 3 or the Philadelphia experiment. They're all referring to the same set of circumstances that occurred in the early 1980s. The Philadelphia experiment was a time travel experiment, the top secret government black ops experiment that went very badly. And Dr. Perret, at least in this, in his writings as Daniel Phoenix 3, he claims that he is one of the computer programmers that was working at Montauk. So that's what he's saying there. Personally, I don't want ETs intervening in our society, dumping their version of absolute truth on us, so-called. One thing I've learned in my life is that nothing is absolute. Everything is measured relative to something else. It cannot be absolute truth, just truth relative to what the ETs have accepted as truth. What bothers a lot of people is that many of us have spent most of our lives looking for truth, and now some alien is going to drop by and hand us a copy of The Universe for Dummies, which will do nothing more than make us feel like our entire life was wasted. I don't mind a few pointers, but I want to do the work for myself. Now, if the ETs want to come by with a big vacuum and suck off all the parasites that have retarded human consciousness and evolution, I'll be the first to shake their hand, claw, tentacle, or whatever. But I don't really want to get rid of a world order just to have it replaced by a stellar order, re-educating and reprogramming me with their truths so I don't have to think for myself. Consciousness doesn't grow from being told facts. It grows from the search for them. And I think that is what the people of this world really need, a chance to grow up on their own in a free society. Hopefully you can use this information to help people get that opportunity. Okay, now that's the end of the paper. There is an addendum at the end. which is called hurricanes. Using the information on the structure of the sun provided by Dewey Larson and Professor KVK Nehru, one can infer a similar structure to planets as the sun. Though the planets have an atmosphere rather than a photosphere, what goes on beneath the mantle is very similar to what goes on in the core of the sun. And the Earth produces similar effects as the sun, but just on a different scale. One of the more prominent features of the sun is that of the sunspots, dark areas that often produce flares and prominences on a recurring cycle. Recent footage has also shown that solar tornadoes are present above these active areas of the sun, stretching thousands of miles. If the Earth were generating its own version of sunspots, what would we see? First, a regular cycle, but at a different scale. Rather than every 11.5 years, perhaps once a year. And when a sunspot formed, there would be a massive vorticular motion to it that would what goes on beneath the mantle is very similar to what goes on in the core of the sun, and the Earth produces similar effects as the sun, but just on a different scale. There again, the scalar motion fundamental. One of the more prominent features of the sun is that of sunspots, dark areas that produce flares and prominences on a recurring cycle. Recent footage has also shown that solar tornadoes are present above these active areas of the sun, stretching thousands of miles. If the Earth were generating its own version of sunspots, what will we see? First, a regular cycle, but just at a different scale. Rather than every 11.5 years, perhaps once a year. And when a sunspot formed, there would be a massive vorticular motion to it that would pull up material from underneath and send it sailing out around it, just as the solar tornado does. We just call it a hurricane. If one examines figures in migration of prominences of Nehru's paper of the solar interior and the sunspots, it shows that hurricanes show up at the same latitudes as sunspots, move in the same fashion, and diminish just as Nehru describes the sunspot cycle. There is a very high correlation. Hurricanes, like sunspots, are just a feature of planets. They are seen on other planets as well, such as the giant red spot on Jupiter, a hurricane. Knowing that hurricanes are the product of co-magnetic threadules in the Earth's core, they are natural events and cannot be artificially created. Nor can they be directed in their early stages when the magnetic forces are at their strongest, but they can be intensified during formation by the same process that creates the supercell thunderstorms mentioned earlier. Excessive amounts of water vapor nuclei forced into the upper atmosphere through chemical seeding of the tropopause to create vast quantities of clouds and torrential rain. When the generating threadule begins to collapse, the hurricane can be controlled by localized changes in temperature and pressure, just what HAARP does best. This was observed in the case of Hurricane Sandy, a small tropical depression that never got to more than a Category 1 hurricane. Nothing spectacular about that, and common for this time of year, except the quantity of water vapor present in the system was significantly higher than it should have been. Watch the animations of the storm as it grows. The center of the storm is literally throwing off massive amounts of clouds because the small amount of ocean water being pulled up met the excessive amounts of condensation nuclei that were sent to that location via atmospheric chemicals, chemtrails. The co-magnetic threadule creating this storm lasted longer than normal, which is why the storm followed the sunspot track rather than being deflected by the Gulf Stream back out to sea, as hurricanes normally are. This indicates that, like the solar transition, Earth is getting ready for a similar change down deep. HAARP would not have been able to direct or deflect this storm with an active threadule, though they probably tried. It followed a natural course, but an unnatural intensity, thanks to chemtrail geoengineering. Okay, that's the end of the addendum and the end of this paper. We will be moving into a different different article starting tomorrow. I'm sorry for this disjointed presentation again today. My phone overheated once again, and so I had to fill in the end, and my editing skills are non-existent. But I'm trying to improve on that. I'm going to do a little work on that here in the future. But thanks for tuning in today. Stay tuned for tomorrow. We'll be getting into something new. And have a great day.